I never meant to hear those words. Standing in my mother-in-law's hallway, I froze as my wife's hushed voice reached my ears. "He's a joke in bed, Mom. I swear I have to fake it every time." Then came the laughter, my mother-in-law's knowing chuckle that turned my blood to ice. 8 years of marriage, and this was how she really saw me. A punchline. A disappointment. That night changed everything. She had no idea I'd hurt her, no clue that her cruel words had shattered our marriage beyond repair. So I let her keep laughing, while I planned my exit. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals happen behind the smiles of those who claim to love you. My name is Daniel Spencer. I'm 42 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought I had a decent marriage. Not perfect, what marriage is, but solid enough. Natalie and I have been together for 8 years, married for 6. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our comfortable silences. At least that's what I thought they were, comfortable. Turns out, there was something else entirely. It was supposed to be just another dinner at my mother-in-law's house in the suburbs of Denver. Sylvia always insisted on hosting us at least once a month, serving up her famous pot roast alongside thinly veiled criticisms of my career choices and subtle digs about when we were going to finally start a family. I'd learned to smile through it, to let it roll off my back. That was my mistake, letting too much roll off my back for too long. I'd stepped out to the hallway to take a quick call from a colleague when I heard them through the partially open kitchen door. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Natalie's hushed tone caught my attention. Something in the way she was speaking, secretive, conspiratorial, made me pause. "He's such a joke in bed, Mom," Natalie whispered, her voice low but clear enough that every word landed like a punch to my gut. "I swear, I have to fake it every single time." Sylvia's response was immediate, a sharp, knowing laugh that echoed through the hallway. "Oh, honey, that's just how men are. At least Daniel provides well enough, right?" Another laugh. More words exchanged that I couldn't quite make out through the sudden ringing in my ears. My hand tightened around my phone, knuckles white with tension. 8 years together. 6 years of marriage. And this was how she really saw me. I should have walked in right then, confronted them both. That's what I keep telling myself I should have done. Instead, I backed away silently, retreating to the guest bathroom where I locked the door and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me seemed different somehow. Smaller. I suddenly saw what they saw. A punchline, a provider, a convenience. Not a partner, not an equal, certainly not someone worthy of respect. I splashed cold water on my face, dried it with one of Sylvia's decorative hand towels that guests weren't supposed to use, and made a decision. I wasn't going to cause a scene. Not tonight. But things were going to change, and they were going to change drastically. When I returned to the dining room, Natalie and Sylvia were already seated, wine glasses in hand, smiling as if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't just torn apart the foundation of what I thought was my life. I took my seat across from them, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Everything okay with work?" Natalie asked, barely glancing up from her phone. "Everything's fine," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Just fine." And for the first time in our marriage, I really looked at my wife. Not with the rose-colored glasses of love or commitment, but with clear eyes that saw the truth. I was married to a stranger who had no respect for me, and I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do about it. Not yet, anyway. The drive home from Sylvia's house was painfully quiet. Natalie scrolled through her phone, occasionally chuckling at something on her screen, completely oblivious to the man sitting next to her. A man who had just had his entire worldview shattered. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, watching the Denver skyline come into view as we descended from the foothills. How many times had we made this drive? How many times had we sat in this exact same silence that I had always interpreted as comfortable familiarity? Now I recognized it for what it really was, indifference. When we got home, Natalie went through her usual routine, kicking off her shoes, changing into her oversized Northwestern t-shirt, and climbing into bed with her phone. I watched her from the doorway, studying her as if seeing her for the first time. In a way, I was. I locked myself in the bathroom, turning on the shower to mask any sound. I needed to think. The mirror reflected a man I barely recognized, someone who had been slowly disappearing for years. When had I started to lose myself? When had I become so focused on making Natalie happy that I'd forgotten what made me happy. I thought back to when we first met, how confident I'd been, how sure of myself. That man wouldn't have tolerated being someone's punchline. I turned the shower off and returned to the bedroom. Natalie was still absorbed in her phone, the blue light illuminating her face in the dimness. "Do you respect me?" I asked, the question cutting through the silence. Her fingers paused momentarily on the screen. She looked up, confused rather than concerned. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one. Do you respect me, Natalie?" She sighed, putting her phone down. "Of course I do. What's this about?" But there was no conviction in her voice, no genuine reassurance. It was automatic, dismissive, like checking a box on a form. What struck me most wasn't her half-hearted answer, but how quickly she returned to her phone, completely uninterested in why I might be asking such a question in the first place. I stood there for a moment longer, then walked to the guest room without another word. I needed space to think, to plan my next move. Because after what I'd heard tonight, one thing was crystal clear. I couldn't continue living in a marriage where I was nothing but a joke, a convenience, an afterthought. That night, as I stared at the ceiling fan slowly rotating above me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Natalie with what I'd heard. Not yet. First, I needed to see for myself just how deep the disrespect ran. I needed to watch and observe without the filter of someone desperately trying to believe his marriage was working. Starting tomorrow, everything would change. Not for her, but for me. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a run in Washington Park, something I hadn't done in months. Natalie always complained that my morning runs disrupted her sleep. Funny how easily I'd given up something I loved for someone who saw me as a joke. When I returned, she was in the kitchen, coffee in hand, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up as I entered. "You went running?" she asked, surprise evident in her tone. "Yeah." I grabbed a water bottle from the fridge. "Feels good to get back to it." She shrugged and returned to her phone. No follow-up questions, no interest in why I'd suddenly resumed an activity I'd once loved. Just indifference. Over the next week, I started watching Natalie with new eyes. I noticed things I'd been blind to before. How she never asked about my day, but expected me to listen to every detail of hers. How she interrupted me when I spoke to her friends, as if my thoughts weren't worth sharing. How she subtly criticized my choices, from the way I dressed to how I loaded the dishwasher. On Thursday night, we had dinner with her work friends at that trendy new place in Lodo. I sat quietly, observing as Natalie talked over me whenever I tried to join the conversation. "Daniel's just not into the whole social media thing," she said when someone asked why they hadn't seen me on her Instagram lately. The way she said it made it sound like I was some technologically challenged dinosaur, rather than someone who simply valued privacy. Her colleague Mark laughed. "Sounds like my dad." Everyone chuckled, including Natalie. I wasn't on the joke. I was the joke. Later that night, I checked our joint credit card statement. $400 at Nordstrom that I didn't recognize. When I asked about it, she rolled her eyes. "It was for Sylvia's birthday. I told you about it weeks ago." She hadn't, but arguing would accomplish nothing. Saturday afternoon, Sylvia called. Natalie put her on speaker as she folded laundry. "Did Daniel fix that leaky faucet yet?" Sylvia asked, her tone dripping with its usual condescension. "No, Mom. You know how he is with household projects." I was standing right there in the doorway. They both knew I could hear them, yet they spoke about me as if I were a disappointing child, not a grown man and equal partner in this marriage. That night, as Natalie slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and thought about my father. He'd always told me that respect was non-negotiable in a relationship. The moment that's gone, he'd said, everything else is just theater. Dad was right. What Natalie and I had wasn't a marriage anymore. It was theater, a performance of domestic life with no substance beneath it. I turned away from her sleeping form and made a mental list of what needed to be done. Because this show was coming to an end sooner than she thought. 2 weeks after that fateful dinner at Sylvia's, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop downtown, across from my old college roommate, Kevin. We'd drifted apart over the years, another casualty of my marriage. Natalie had always found him too loud and immature. Looking back, I realized she'd systematically isolated me from most of my friends. "You look like hell," Kevin said bluntly, stirring his Americano. I hadn't told him why I'd reached out after nearly a year of silence, just that I needed to catch up. But Kevin had always been perceptive. Marriage troubles, I admitted, the words feeling strange on my tongue. I'd never spoken them aloud before. Kevin nodded, unsurprised. I figured something was up when Natalie started untagging you from her posts last year. I blinked. She what? He pulled out his phone. Show me her Instagram. There I was, gradually disappearing from her social media presence over the past year. In the few photos where I remained, I was often partially cropped out or looking away. Digital erasure. Symbolic of what had been happening in our real life. I'm thinking of leaving her, I said quietly. Kevin didn't look shocked. About time. His immediate support loosened something in my chest. For the first time since overhearing Natalie's words, I felt like I wasn't crazy for feeling betrayed. I need a lawyer, I said, and a place to stay, just for a while. I've got a spare room, Kevin offered without hesitation. As for lawyers, my cousin Sarah is one of the best divorce attorneys in Colorado. I'll text you her number. I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and grief. This was really happening. That evening, I called Sarah from my car in the parking garage at work. She was direct and efficient, laying out exactly what I needed to do. Gather financial documents, change passwords, secure personal items of value, find temporary housing, all while maintaining the status quo at home. The element of surprise is your only advantage, she advised. Once you serve papers, the dynamic will change completely. I thought about the way Natalie casually dismissed me, how she and Sylvia spoke about me when they thought I couldn't hear. How would they react when they realized I'd been listening all along? Back home, Natalie was on the phone with her mother, laughing about something. She waved absently as I walked in, not bothering to end her call. I smiled back, playing my part. But inside, something had hardened. The hurt was crystallizing into resolve, the confusion into clarity. This weekend, Natalie was flying to Chicago for her college roommate's bachelorette party. She'd be gone for 3 days. Perfect timing to set my plan in motion. Friday morning, I kissed Natalie goodbye as she left for the airport. Her overnight bag seemed unusually large for a 3-day trip, but I didn't comment. I'd stopped asking questions weeks ago, part of my strategy to appear disinterested while I made my preparations. Try not to burn the house down, she joked as she slipped into her Uber. I forced a laugh. Have fun with the girls. As soon as her car disappeared around the corner, I sprang into action. Sarah had given me a detailed checklist, and I had exactly 72 hours to complete it. First stop, our home office. I gathered tax returns, investment statements, property deeds, and insurance policies, scanning everything into a secure cloud drive that only I could access. I photographed valuables, artwork we'd collected, Natalie's jewelry, most of which I'd paid for, electronics and furniture. Next, I headed to the bank. I withdrew half the money from our joint savings account, not a penny more than what was legally fair, and opened a new account at a different bank. I provided the manager with a copy of my new mailing address, Kevin's place in Capitol Hill. By evening, I was systematically working through Sarah's checklist. Change passwords on personal email accounts. Check. Secure personal documents like birth certificate and passport. Check. Order credit reports. Check. Begin documenting instances of disrespect or mistreatment. Check. That part was easy. I had plenty of material. Saturday morning, I rented a small storage unit and moved items of personal value. My grandfather's fly fishing gear, the vintage record collection Natalie had always threatened to donate, family photos from before our marriage. Things I couldn't bear to lose in a contentious divorce. That afternoon, Kevin helped me move essential clothing and personal items to a spare room. We worked efficiently, knowing time was limited. You're doing the right thing, Kevin reassured me as we loaded the last box into his SUV. I watched you disappear these past few years. The old Daniel wouldn't have taken this crap for so long. He was right. I'd compromised myself piece by piece, try to earn respect that should have been freely given. On Sunday, I returned everything to perfect order. The house looked untouched, with no evidence of my preparations. I even prepared Natalie's favorite dinner for when she returned, a final act in my role as devoted husband. That evening, I stood in our bedroom, looking at the wedding photo on the dresser. We looked happy, hopeful. Had it all been an illusion from the start? Or had something broken along the way? It hardly mattered now. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. Flight landed. Be home in an hour. I took a deep breath, readying myself for the performance of normalcy. But something had shifted inside me. The man who had overheard his wife's cruel words at Sylvia's dinner table was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone with a plan, with self-respect, with boundaries. Someone who was finally ready to walk away. Natalie returned Sunday night, exhausted but glowing from her weekend in Chicago. She breezed through the door, barely acknowledging me as she wheeled her suitcase to the bedroom. I noticed she had a new bracelet, gold with small diamonds. Not the kind of trinket you'd typically buy yourself at a bachelorette party. How was the party? I asked, setting a plate of her favorite pasta carbonara on the dining table. Amazing. She scrolled through her phone, showing me photos of the girls at various clubs and restaurants. Jenna's fiancé arranged for us to have VIP access at the Underground. You know, that exclusive club I told you about. I nodded, though she'd never mentioned it before. Another small lie in a tapestry of deception. As she talked, I studied her body language, relaxed, confident, without a trace of guilt or discomfort. The perfect performance of a wife sharing her weekend with her husband. Except I didn't believe the performance anymore. "You're being quiet," she remarked as she finished her wine. "Everything okay?" In the past, I would have immediately reassured her. Now I simply shrugged. "Just tired." Her brow furrowed slightly in my uncharacteristic lack of interest, but the moment passed quickly. She was far too absorbed in her own world to notice the seismic shifts in mine. Over the next 2 weeks, I implemented phase 2 of Sarah's strategy, emotional distancing. I came home later from work. I stopped texting during the day. I declined invitations to dinner with her friends. Small changes, nothing dramatic enough to trigger suspicion, but enough to create distance. At first, Natalie didn't seem to notice. Then, slowly, I saw confusion creep into her expressions when I didn't respond to her the way I used to. Like a pet owner whose dog suddenly stops fetching. She was perplexed by the change in behavior, but not particularly concerned. The third Thursday after her Chicago trip, I was working late in our home office when Natalie came in looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Are we okay?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. I looked up from my laptop. "What do you mean? You've been different lately." "Distant." I closed my computer, giving her my full attention. "Have I?" "Yes." She crossed her arms defensively. "You hardly talk to me anymore. You've been coming home late. You didn't even react when my mother called to say she's extending her Vail condo stay and wants us to visit." I hadn't reacted because I knew I wouldn't be going to Vail with her. Not now. Not ever again. But she didn't need to know that yet. "I've just been busy," I said, my voice carefully neutral. End of quarter is always crazy at work. She seemed to accept this, relieved to have an explanation that didn't require deeper examination of our relationship. "Well, try to be more present," she said, the command thinly veiled as a request. People were starting to notice. Lisa asked if we were having problems. There it was. Not concern for our relationship, but concern for how it appeared to others. Classic Natalie. "I'll work on it," I promised, knowing it was the last promise I'd ever make her. That night, as Natalie slept beside me, I slipped out of bed and finished packing the last essentials I'd need at Kevin's place. In 3 days, the divorce papers would be ready. In 3 days, Natalie would finally understand that I had heard every word at her mother's house, and that those words had consequences. As I carefully closed a drawer, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. For the first time in years, I recognized the man looking back at me. The day before the divorce papers were to be served, I felt an unexpected wave of nostalgia. Not regret, I was far beyond that, but a mourning for what could have been. 8 years of my life invested in a relationship that had been rotting from within. I allowed myself 1 hour to feel the grief before locking it away. Sarah called that afternoon. "Everything's set for tomorrow. The server will deliver the papers to her office around 2 p.m. Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." Remember, once she's served, don't engage in lengthy discussions. Keep communications brief and documented. And absolutely do not move back into the house, no matter what she says. That evening, Natalie suggested we go out to dinner. "We haven't had a date night in forever," she said, smiling in a way that once would have melted me. Now I saw the calculation behind it. My distance had finally registered as a threat, and she was trying to reestablish the dynamic she was comfortable with. One where she controlled the relationship. "Sure," I agreed, curious to see how she would play this. She chose our old standby, an upscale Italian place in Cherry Creek where the staff knew us by name. As we settled into our familiar corner table, I observed her carefully. She'd worn the blue dress I once told her was my favorite, applied extra effort to her makeup, and was being unusually attentive. "I feel like we've been missing each other lately," she said, reaching for my hand across the table. "I know I've been busy with work and friends, but I want us to reconnect." The performance was flawless. If I hadn't heard her words at Sylvia's house, hadn't spent weeks cataloging her disrespect, I might have been fooled. I played along, curious how far she would take it. Later that night, she initiated intimacy for the first time in months. As she moved against me in the darkness, I couldn't help wondering if she was faking it now, just as she told her mother she always did. The thought killed any desire I might have felt. "Is something wrong?" she asked when I pulled away. "Just tired," I lied, turning to my side of the bed. The confusion on her face was genuine. She wasn't used to rejection, especially not after deploying her most effective tools of manipulation. Morning came with a knot in my stomach. I left early, ostensibly for a breakfast meeting, actually to avoid any last moments of pretense. As I backed out of the driveway, I took a final look at the house we'd bought together 4 years ago, with its meticulous landscaping and custom mailbox bearing both our names. By dinner, only her name would remain. I texted Kevin, "It's happening today." His response was immediate. "You've got this. Come by after work. Beer will be cold." At my office, I tried to focus on spreadsheets and client calls, but my mind kept drifting to Natalie. Would she call screaming or show up at my workplace? Would she cry or threaten? By now, she would know not only that I was leaving, but that I'd overheard her that night at Sylvia's. At 2:15 p.m., my phone buzzed. Natalie's face appeared on the screen. It was time. I didn't answer Natalie's call. Instead, I texted, "I'll meet you at home at 6. We can talk then." Sarah had advised against meeting at the house, but I wanted this confrontation on familiar ground. One last time in the space we'd share before closing that chapter completely. The rest of the workday passed in a blur. Colleagues noticed my distraction, but attributed it to an upcoming project deadline. If only they knew the real deadline I was facing. I arrived home at exactly 6 p.m. Natalie's car was already in the driveway, along with another I recognized immediately, Sylvia's Mercedes. Of course she'd call her mother. I should have expected that. The moment I walked through the door, Natalie launched herself at me, papers clutched in her hand. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "Divorce papers? Are you out of your mind?" Sylvia stood in the background, arms crossed, her face a mask of righteous indignation. I remained calm, setting down my briefcase. "I think the papers are pretty clear, Natalie." "Clear? There's nothing clear about this. Everything was fine until..." "Until what?" I interrupted. "Until I stopped playing along. Until I stopped accepting being treated like an afterthought in my own marriage." Her expression shifted from anger to calculation. "What are you talking about?" "I've always..." "He's a joke in bed, Mom. I swear I have to fake it every time." I quoted her words verbatim, watching as the color drained from her face. "Sound familiar?" "It should. Those were your exact words at your mother's house last month." Sylvia gasped. Natalie's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. "I heard everything." I continued, my voice steady. "I was in the hallway when you decided to share that particular insight with your mother." And she laughed. You both laughed. "You were eavesdropping on a private conversation." Natalie finally managed, attempting to shift blame. "I wasn't eavesdropping. I was walking back from taking a call when I heard my wife describing me as a sexual failure to her mother. Tell me, what's the appropriate response to that?" Sylvia stepped forward. "Now, Daniel, every marriage has its rough patches. This isn't about a rough patch." I cut her off. "This is about respect. Or rather, the complete lack of it." Natalie's strategy shifted instantly. Tears filled her eyes. Impressive how she could summon them on command. "It was just girl talk," she pleaded. "It didn't mean anything. You're throwing away 8 years over one stupid comment." "It wasn't just one comment," I replied. "It was the culmination of years of disrespect. That moment just opened my eyes to what I'd been ignoring." She moved toward me, reaching for my arm. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling." I stepped back. "There's nothing to fix, Natalie. I'm done being the butt of your jokes. Done being someone you tolerate rather than respect." "Where have you even been staying?" she demanded, noticing for the first time that some of my things were missing. "That's not your concern anymore." "This is ridiculous," Sylvia interjected. You can't just walk away from a marriage. I turned to her, feeling oddly calm. Actually, I can. And I have. Now who's laughing? The stunned silence that followed was answer enough. The week following our confrontation was exactly as chaotic as Sarah had predicted. Natalie cycled through every emotion possible. Anger, tears, bargaining, threats, sometimes all within the same phone call. You'll regret this, she hissed during one particularly heated exchange. I'm going to take you for everything you're worth. I'll let Sarah handle the legal threats. That's what I was paying her for. Sylvia was worse. She left scathing voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. After everything we did for you, she fumed in one message. Natalie gave you the best years of her life. I deleted them all without responding. Friends and acquaintances began taking sides. Some reached out with awkward messages of support. Others disappeared entirely. A few of Natalie's friends sent accusatory texts, having heard who knows what version of events. I blocked their numbers without reading beyond the first few words. Through it all, Kevin's spare room became my sanctuary. Stay as long as you need, he insisted, despite the cramped quarters. 10 days after I moved out, I met Sarah at her office to review Natalie's counterproposal. It was exactly what we'd expected. Demand for the house, half my retirement, and substantial alimony despite her own six-figure income. Standard opening gambit, Sarah assured me. Her lawyer's posturing. They know she has no grounds for these demands, especially given Colorado's equitable distribution laws. Still, seeing Natalie's signature on documents designed to financially cripple me felt like a punch to the gut. Whatever love had once existed between us was now unrecognizable. That evening, I drove past our house, her house now, and saw Sylvia's car in the driveway. The lights were on in the kitchen, two silhouettes visible through the blinds. Mother and daughter, no doubt strategizing their next move against me. It should have hurt more than it did. Instead, I felt strangely liberated. Back at Kevin's, I poured myself a bourbon and stepped onto his balcony. Downtown Denver glittered beneath a clear autumn sky, the mountains a dark silhouette against the horizon. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to think beyond the divorce, beyond the legal battle ahead. Where would I live? What would I do with my newfound freedom? Who would I become now that I wasn't defining myself as Natalie's husband? Kevin joined me, handing me a cigar. You look better, he observed. Less haunted. I feel better, I admitted. Like I'm waking up from a long sleep. You kind of are. He lit a cigar, then mine. The Daniel I knew in college wouldn't have tolerated half the crap you've put up with these past years. He was right. I'd compromised myself piece by piece, surrendering my identity to save a marriage that wasn't worth saving. What's next? Kevin asked after a comfortable silence. I took a deep draw from the cigar, savoring the rich flavor. I start over. On my terms this time. The future stretched before me. Uncertain, but full of possibility. And for the first time in years, I was actually looking forward to it. 6 months later, I stood in the living room of my new condo in downtown Denver, watching snow fall gently over the city. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, faster than expected once Natalie realized her demands weren't going to fly with the judge. In the end, we split assets equitably. She kept the house with a buyout payment to me. I kept my retirement accounts, and we went our separate ways without alimony, a victory Sarah considered worth her substantial fees. The last time I saw Natalie was at the final hearing. She looked smaller somehow, diminished without the power she once held over me. Sylvia sat beside her, tight-lipped and rigid, avoiding my gaze. As we left the courthouse, Natalie caught up to me in the hallway. I never meant to hurt you, she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I know, I replied, surprised to find I actually believed her. But you did. There was nothing left to say after that. Kevin helped me find a condo, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that made the premium price worth every penny. After months in his spare room, having my own place again felt like exhaling after holding my breath underwater. I'd reconnected with old friends, started dating casually, even took up rock climbing, something Natalie had always dismissed as too dangerous. The Daniel who emerged from the wreckage of my marriage was more authentic, more confident, and infinitely happier than the man who had stood frozen in Sylvia's hallway 8 months earlier. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel, a corporate attorney I'd been seeing for the past month. Still on for dinner? I made reservations at that new place in Rhino you mentioned. I smiled, typing back my confirmation. Rachel was different from anyone I'd dated before, independent, direct, respectful. We moved at our own pace, giving each other space without keeping score. As I grabbed my keys to head out, I caught sight of myself in the mirror by the door. The man looking back at me was someone I recognized now. Not perfect, still healing in some ways, but authentic in a way I hadn't been for years. That night at Sylvia's house, hearing those crushing words from my wife's lips, had seemed like the end of something. In reality, it had been the beginning. I stepped out into the snowy evening, leaving my past behind with each footprint in the fresh powder. Ahead lay a future I was finally excited to live, on my terms, with people who valued me, in a life that felt genuinely mine. Some endings are just beginnings in disguise. Mine certainly was.